All right. This is a pre-recording, obviously, of lesson one for H Radio 123 part-timers. I am Chris. I'm your lecturer for the year. Please, that I'm not sure as to why no one was online for the class this week, but if you need the information of where to obviously like access the MS Teams meeting, please just go to Call Campus, go to the part-timers a link where you see Chris part-timers and then just join on the general meeting there. I will obviously be, online beforehand. Within the chat, you'll see that there'll be an alert that I am active right there, and you can just join directly. But the details are there, and just in the future, please also communicate on WhatsApp as to whether you are lost or whether you are confused or whether you need assistance in terms of accessing either whatever it is, the material, your assessments, and again, obviously, class, right? Please note that we'd prefer not to pre-record the lectures because we have a lot of time that's allocated every week, 6 to 10. Please, we'd like to do a lot of practical aspects, and it's obviously not as effective doing it just from a one-sided conversation. Okay, all right. Without the preaching continuing, welcome to Radio One. I do hope that this semester is going to be enriching for you, and it's going to raise your interest in radio. And hopefully you'll carry on with it in Radio 2 and Radio 3. Right. It's Radio 123 part-timers. So just again, I think I've done a bit of the admin there. In terms of registry, what I'll do is I'll obviously have a look if necessary at the attendance that teams will show because it will obviously reflect. And again, once again, if there are any more, like I say, queries, please do ask. All right. So we're going to do the first lesson now. It's quite a cool lesson. It's the introduction to the radio landscape, so that you have a better understanding as to where we come from in terms of our radio history here in South Africa. Why certain milestones were really important for us, and obviously how everything just evolved into commercial aspects and privatizations, etc. Right now, look into community radio is also very important, and looking at different aspects of maybe some of the laws and legislations that might also be of interest. Let's quickly go to some admin here as well. Just to know that is it's not Justin. That will be. Let me just fix that. Uh, Chris Jordan, right? And if you need my email address, point it out here for you. You can just go to info at Chris Jordan media.net, right? Just a little bit of background on myself. So I have had 24 years in the broadcasting industry. So I've worked on every kind of platform. When I say in terms of radio, commercial, campus, community, online, as well as retail and international as well. I do have my own little like private little company where I do innovation, Chris Jordan Media, as you can see there. And well, I do some work, for some stations, community stations, and also work in the city as well. Predominantly focusing on a lot of podcasts at the moment, and again, new media is my focus. Also work with corporates in project management and also helping with their understanding of new media and how that actually can work. Also have certifications in applied digital skills on Google, like knowing how to work with SEOs, etc. So got a brief. I'm going to say it's a brief roundup, a lot more in there, but I think it's more for me to reflect on more, so than for you to have to listen to more of that. Okay. But just so that you know, I'm here for you. I have a lot of experience. I have a lot of knowledge to share, and I'd love to share it with you. Okay. So here are, there's a bit of a breakdown, a rough breakdown as to what the lectures might look like. There's a couple of extensions. The radio landscape might be extended. I think I've seen it in the third lesson or so as well. to mitigate it. Over non-contact hours, please note that you have to put in, let's say, 6 extra hours for these particular two lectures: 4 to 12, 8 to 20, 14 to 40. Radio professionalism, programming, and creating content are the four major areas that we want to be focusing on throughout this semester. Right, please be very diligent about the work, very diligent about your formatives and your summatives. I think every lecturer has said that to you, but we'll say it continuously. When we do get to the formatives, we'll have an assessment breakdown. You can ask any questions. Once again, there will be, with that particularly, I will record a video so you can keep on looking back at that for any clarity if you have any questions or whatever it may be, right? But let's not go too far ahead. I think I'm going to do the briefing for that next week, right? But I will alert you in the WhatsApp group. Okay. So just looking at where you can look at the pages within the next level radio textbook that you do have, it's all coming out from there. The introduction, page 2, the evolution of South African radio, page 3, commercial radio, page 5, and public radio, page 7, community radio, page 12. I'm going to check something out quickly. Just give me a second. Uh, right. I always have to double check that I am recording. Anyway, okay, all right. So, I'm going to reference some parts or aspects of the textbook so you can read along as you follow the lesson. I don't have those particular snapshots of the textbook that I will be looking at, for example, the examples or the activities, some of the activities, right? But please follow along with the textbook. We are starting at the very beginning. Okay. All right. So, what three services are, or make up, compartmentalize our industry, our radio industry, our radio landscape, and what are they? So, if you think of, and don't go ahead with the slides if you are following, like I'm just saying, let's do this, have a little bit of fun, right? Okay, so the first one is that everyone knows is community radio, right? So we have a lot of community stations in South Africa. It's in the very high 300s. So I think it is the high 300s, but it's over 300. Um, chop and changing kind of every year. Some get deregistered or delicensed or whatever it is, unlicensed, and then new ones pop up as well, depending on what it is that the ICASA itself thinks that there is a demand in or a need for in our different communities around South Africa, right? But community radio is, I suppose, maybe the most obvious one, right? Because I don't think yet that you know the term for the second one or the third one, but obviously that you tend to listen to most of all the second one, which is commercial radio, right? Commercial radio is, defined as those that are in it for revenue. Um, Obviously a commercial approach to radio. So we'll give examples in just a second, right? Big stations, big money, big names, that type of thing, right? And then the third one are the PBS stations, so the public broadcast services that we do have there. They also, I mean, they are filtered under the SABC itself, uh, commercial, privatized SABC, and obviously privatized companies. We'll get into that as well. Community belongs to, well, I mean, the community, not necessarily SABC or anyone else, right? Anyway, going back to PBS stations, PBS stations are ones that, work towards or support certain cultures within our South African diverse nation, right? So, for example, obviously, we want languages and cultures, um, isiZulu, Sepedi, Tswana, right? Tonga, I think there might be one for Tonga. Right, and we have those there, but we also have Afrikaans as well. So examples, an immediate example, I think for Afrikaans, everyone should know is Ariskia. Right, and then we also have ones that have changed their license slightly, depending obviously on particular demands. So, for example, Radio 2000 is a bit of a hybrid, but we all know that Radio 2000 used to be primarily just for sports broadcasts, right? Okay, and that's why it served its purpose, right? Public. broadcast services. All right, here we go. Public service radio, public broadcast or PBS, public broadcast services, commercial radio, right, and then community radio are the three diversities or three groupings that we do have here in South Africa. Okay, so let's look at a little bit of the history. We've had quite a, I mean, it's colorful to say the least, and not to be disrespectful, but we do know where South Africa came from and where we are right now. So we know that obviously the broadcasting had a massive effect or was affected by the political, landscape as well. So let's start a little bit like it very very early. I mean, if you've noted this year, I think just last month, this month, where we in February, February, yeah. So we celebrated 100 years, quote unquote, radio, right? 100 years. So back in 1924, right? Okay. Here, even in South Africa, right? We looks like we began to broadcast in 1924. So we had 100 years around the world. The Americans started in 1920. Which is very cool. I actually listened to that first broadcast. I got a bit nostalgic, and obviously because I love radio, I had to listen to that first broadcast. It lasted 18 hours. One like one presenter, very cool as well. Like this presenter was predominantly trying to procure for listeners. If anyone, he was saying, if anyone is listening, let us know. Like we want to know as far, if how far our reach is being heard or whatever it may be. So the broadcast actually lasted, like I say, 18 hours. Specifically, like I say, I think it was on. Man, I must just get my stats correctly, but it was like on a KWAW or whatever it is, which is some. It's not KWAW, right? I think it's KWDW or whatever it is, right? Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's an American thing, right? So so anyway, so they started it officially right there in 1920. We know that America, and we'll look at that in, I think, the next lesson, right? We'll look at, let's say, the international standing or the status or the participation or whatever it is of broadcasting in other countries like the UK and the States and Australia, whatever it may be, right? These are the big forerunners in the innovation of radio. They've had a lot more time to be able to practice and to test and to trial whatever it is, radio, as well as they've got a lot more stations, a lot more people listening as well. Um, and again, very successful. We don't like to shape ourselves off those particular countries because we are a unique country on our own, like every other country, and our community, our, like I say, citizens in our country require something specific, right? Okay, to South Africans as well. But they are the forerunners, as I said before, because they've had more time, obviously, to work on the or work with the medium as well. And again, not to get into that too much, but like for example, in England, we have the BBC, which occupies, I think, about 90% of the media, and that's wanted. So it's not forced or it's not a dictatorship or whatever it is, or some kind of like propaganda. The BBC is actually accepted and invited by 90% of that English population, and so they do own the medium. I'm saying the media space to that large degree, which is unheard of, but it's actually super respectable. Um, right. Anyway, okay. In South Africa, the first radio broadcast took place in 1923. Right. Okay. So three licenses were issued: one in Johannesburg, one in Cape Town, and Durban. South African Railways in Johannesburg on December 1923. The Cape and Peninsula Broadcasting Association started a similar service in Cape Town, and that was in September 1924, and then Durban followed suit in December 1924. So back then in 1927, we had the ABC. I'm sure you can recognize that we're missing a South African, right? An SABC, which happens to be just underneath that a little later. But the ABC was formed instead of the government taking ownership of the three stations. They were responsible, or responsibilities of the ABC right back then, right? So they managed them or whatever it is. Um, we started getting a good feel for how to run radio in South Africa. So the ABC struggled financially, right? And in 1936, the company was dissolved. Oops. In its place, the South African Broadcasting Corporation, the SABC, right, was created under Act number 22 of our, obviously our legislation. The SABC bought all the ABC licenses and obviously began broadcasting in 1936. So we are again not a big there wasn't a break or anything like that. It was just a transference, right, between the two. Okay, so in 1943, once again, as a kind of obviously, again, the basis of racism, right? Okay, but segregation is a better word to, I said, a more diplomatic word, I guess. Um, Still insensitive, right? Segregation started to really come to the forefront, right? Wasn't only 1943, it was before that as well. But the SABC did launch African language services in isiZulu, isiXhosa, and Sesotho, right? Okay. But the thing is that broadcast was monitored by obviously the government. It was scripted by the government, and there weren't many hours that were allocated to the African languages as well. Right today, the SABC does broadcast, and they call it, if I'm not mistaken, they call it Bantu Radio. Right. Um, Today, the SABC broadcasts through 19 publicly owned radio stations. Right. TV only arrived in 1976, very late. And that's why I said this to my other students, man. I was born in 1980. And yes, to you, like that's like ancient times for you. But that's not, I mean, I'm 43. That's not a long time ago. This is like just under, what is that? My maths is not the best there. What is it? 51 years, right? No, yeah, 51, 52. Yeah, okay. 2 years of television in this country. That's crazy, right? But for 50 years, South Africans only relied on radio stations, news, entertainment, to a large extent, education as well. So we had a lot of, well, we kind of also mimicked what radio was in the real olden days, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, especially with the world wars and whatever it may be, where it became like it was mandatory as part of like a person, like a human being's consumption throughout the day, because you needed to get all the information. And print was obviously very slow. It was obviously existing. Television started overseas, I think, just after the Second World War, right? And it came very, very, very late. I mean, I was a kid when I was like 6 or whatever it is. It seemed like between 10 years later that I thought, well, how would I know? Is that I mean, TV was fine. It had everything. It had the cartoons, had the morning shows, whatever it is, and whatever it is. If you wanted something in simulcast, like you knew to turn on the radio, you need to go to, let's say, a certain frequency and be able to hear it in a certain language as well. It was great. Like good times, man. Good times, simple times, right? The only extremely terrible thing that only ended in, what was it, 94, was uh, well, the lack of democracy, the complete absence of democracy um, from our apartheid government. Of course, we look back and are not proud of that, but we look forward and we are hopeful for a continuing future here in South Africa. Today, 90% of South Africans still listen to radio. In fact, I think about 92%. The average time spent listening is more than 4 hours a day. In fact, it's gone up. It's around about 5 hours, 5 hours, 8 minutes. Well, I think on average, 45% of listeners listen to about 20 hours of radio weekly. That's crazy, right? So we really appreciate the medium, and we still are very dependent. Yes, sure, you can argue that, and it's a valid argument. So in our rural communities, which are a large majority of South Africa, like it's newspapers and radio is still very prominent. Obviously, like highly prominent in these areas. It's a dependable, but we know that it's a dependable medium. You're going to get facts. You're going to get stats, you're going to get conversation, you're going to get connection, community, whatever it may be. So radio isn't just because, we have different classes that vary quite diversely here in South Africa. You can look at metropolitan areas like Gauteng, where it's a very extreme, it's a high population, yeah. And we know that they are also avid radio listeners. Okay. It may seem like when you look just to your left and to your right, that radio is quote unquote a dying medium. It really isn't, just because of the introduction of new mediums like social media, like dynamic media, I would say, which is hybrids for me, and podcasting, etc. And streaming, perhaps maybe online stations or online services like our Spotify's or iTunes or whatever it may be. There's so many as well of those. Um, radio is quote unquote again not that much of a popular medium. It really isn't. Like if we want to include something into our lifestyle, we'll choose to make time for it. As you know, you can spend a certain amount of hours watching TV every day, or on certain days, you can spend so much time on social media. You can spend so much time on, say, social messaging, so WhatsApp and whatever it may be. Definitely listen to the radio, maybe read some digital print, whatever it may be. Right, all in terms of being able to, again, process all, process, like bring in that information, right? Okay, radio is prolific and powerful. It's a medium of communication, regardless of economic status or geography. At the end of the day, we have real time conversations, real people about real issues, right? We have it immediately. That's a really big thing, real time, right? Okay. So we have a little bit of the evolution, right? Some of this is repeated there, but anyway, over 300 licensed radio stations in South Africa. We do not look at internet-based stations like Cliff Central, for example, the one prominent and profitable legacy online station that South Africa does have. Everyone else kind of like fell away and faded, back and forth at any one given time. I'm not going to carry on about this, but there are hundreds of online stations that are active, but they're active for a very short time. So they have a very large and quick expiration date. And I say large, it's like I mean like it's the stats for that. Excuse the kids outside that you hear. The stats for that is it's astounding. How many radio stations are online, right? Quote unquote, by a lot of businesses that don't know what they're doing. They coerce people into working for them. They completely close the station or I say the online station after 2, 3 months because they don't know how to work with revenue or they don't know how to bring in listeners at all, active participants or users. Anyway, doesn't matter. We're not talking about internet-based stations in this particular lecture. Right. 22 privately owned commercial stations. So Kakiso, Prime Media, and then I think it's African, sure, just to get the name right. Uh, yeah, where is that that name? Right. So there we go. African Media Entertainment. I was gonna get it wrong. African Media Entertainment, right, are the privatized companies that do own, again, privatized radio stations. Privatized radio stations will tell you now in just a moment. I'll tell you, I'm not the queen. It's not a we, not a plural, right? Although a late queen. Right, privatized station. I'll give you examples of those, of who belongs to Prime Media, Kiso, and so on and so forth, right? And 19 are owned by the SABC, right? SABC is public broadcaster. And the SABC is dependent on advertising revenue, even though its only shareholder is the Minister of Communications. Interesting, very interesting, right? SABC can also get some of its revenue through TV license fees. Obviously, I mean, they force you. You can't buy a TV anymore without them catching you and saying, pay your 4, 5, 6,000 rand in arrears. SABC is not a state broadcaster. Only 3% of its funds come from government. And the rest of the radio stations are community radio stations. They're self-funded. Many are non-profit organizations. They classify them under NGOs. Um, NPOs, NGOs, whatever it may be, right? They are widely managed and staffed by volunteer work. So for free, you go in there, you start a community station, you work for free so they can give you in return experience, knowledge, training, and obviously kind of uh, like public, I mean, you're getting a public image, right? So a public platform to be able to practice your skills, right, and sharpen them, and get ready for if you are good enough to move over to commercial radio, right? As for radio licenses, they are granted by ICASA. Very rarely do we create it. ICASA just creates a brand new license out of a request. Normally, ICASA will decide which, let's say, licenses, be it community or commercial, right, they are going to obviously form, right, stipulate whatever it is, construct, depending on what needs are available in different provinces, for example, or different communities, right? So then I'll say, okay, for example, like we're missing a little bit, we'd like to start up a competitor for talk radio, right? Or talk and music hybrids, for example, like Kaya, right? Uh, because let's say one station might be dominating, right, the market also. So, for example, I'm talking about, let's say, like 702 versus Power FM, Power FM versus Kaya FM, and then we have obviously the national one, which is SAFM, right? There's not a lot of options when we want to do or choose talk radio as an option there. And again, before Power or Kaya was introduced, 702 was the monopoly, right? Here in Gauteng, it was the monopoly, and you couldn't, I mean, all the revenue that went there and all the listeners that wanted to listen to had a choice of SAFM, but 702 was the better choice of the two. It's a lot more polished. It's definitely of a higher standard, great, better presenters. Just in general, it hasn't really changed. SFM is great, but it's just not 702. So we bring in some competitors, see how they can challenge. Obviously the competitive stations, right? And you get the idea. The Independent Communications Authority of South Africa is mandated to issue licenses, ensure universal service and access, monitor the industry, hear disputes along with the BCCSA, um, the plan manage frequency spectrums. So choose a frequency. Like if you're applying for it, man, it is a long process. So especially if yeah, I mean, you're trying to access like an FM frequency, maybe changing over from AM to FM. AM is very, I mean, if you've listened to any AM stations, it's got that kind of very uh it's different, not polished, it's not clear sound quality, not great sound quality, right? Sounds almost like it's some kind of broadcast from a very, very distant area. Anyway, it doesn't matter. We know what to expect from AM anyway, and FM is obviously where stations want to be. With that nice clarity and whatever it may be, the difference in quality. Okay, protect customers from unfair business practices. And in 2017, CASA ceased the issuing of new licenses due to lack of available frequencies on the analog broadcast spectrum. That was a long time ago, and they restarted it, funny enough, just before COVID. Right to say. So I'm saying they restarted specifically. Okay, so let me get this. Let me just straighten this out. So pre much the way before, okay, COVID. So definitely in a 2013, 2012, 2011, they started issuing commercial licenses. Like I say, so Smile FM came up. We had, I think Akasi FM was one as well. We had, I said Smile already. We had Power FM come up as one of those as well. So new commercial stations were licensed. The idea was to license a commercial station in all the main provinces, right? I don't think it actually got that far. They stopped at I think four or five stations. Um, And then, like I said, there was this situation here. Then in 20, like I said, at the end of 2019, definitely 2020, because I remember during COVID reading this, where there were 29 stations that lost their licenses. So ICASA like discontinued their licenses, doesn't matter whether they were like profitable or not. And they were making 32, I think specifically community station licenses available for obviously like people to come and uh, what's the word I'm looking for, but you know uh, what is it, compete for it, right? And they would apply for that particular license. That's a better word, right? Okay. Anyway, so we did have, like I said, that ceasefire in terms of commercial stations, definitely. But I mean, I would add a station that's barely 3 years old, right? So we know that that license for 919 specifically was issued on the old back end of the Hot FM, right? I think Hot is on now 102.7, but before they were on 91.9, right? And so the frequency was actually given over in quite an unprecedented display of, I suppose, actually, it's questionable. We don't even know. I don't even know the backstory as to how quickly, like 919 was given that license, right? Um, but it was available, and so they issued it to obviously the stakeholders that did apply for it, right? Okay. All right. Anyway, okay. So ICASA plans to implement new digital broadcast technologies in the future. So, around the world, we've seen obviously the introduction of DAB, right? DAB plus, and definitely the Nordic countries are very famous. So, for example, I think it is Norway. In Sweden, I think they've done away with FM AM frequency completely and completely switched over to digital audio broadcasting, which is very clear. There's no white noise, there's access to it. The DAB receivers are obviously of a higher standard than the normal radio receiver that we do have in our cars, or, for example, in our radios. Uh, Moving away from the analog and moving to digital, man, what am I looking for? Broadcasting. There we go. Digital broadcast. All right. Anyway, and then DRM, the Digital Radio Mondial, right? South Africans will need government subsidized set-top boxes, so STBs, for this to work, because we're not going to put in the money. We can't afford that, man. Like, and also we have a lot of cars that need to, like, we have old cars, right? That obviously need to be reinstalled or take the radio out, put a DAB receiver in. So specifically, also, I mean, like my main thing is for public transport. So our taxis and our buses or whatever it may be, those should be the first to get the DAB receivers, because it's a part of the package. You got to put the radio on, whatever it may be, right? And they are running a business, so like they can't be shut out. If we do even the parallel transition over, right? So to hand over to digital audio broadcasting while still, like we have the analog, which is normally what happens, right? There's going to be a long transition period here in South Africa because we have quite a lot to implement, right? So whether a station is owned by government or not, SA radio stations operate on a commercial business principle and operational practice. Even obviously, yes, community needs to make money, so we must operate every single station that is out there as a business, because it is a business. It needs to make money. It has staff. It has resources. It has whatever community obligations, whatever it may be, right? So it has many moving parts of like a normal business. It is a normal business, right? But it's just one that's targeted within media. Radio station's product is its content. It can sell that content not only within its footprint, but also outside of that traditional footprint if there's interest to another market. So, looking at, for example, digital opportunities to be able to sell, certain aspects like, again, podcasts or a coverage or maybe streaming services like a streaming station. In the case of East Coast Radio, that does have like completely like 100% digital, like I'm saying, streaming radio stations that are independent of East Coast Radio and its programming, right? I think it's called East Coast Gold. Um, but yeah, yeah. Anyway, that's an example there. Okay. And like many commercial businesses, radio stations are dependent on consumers, right? Listeners, definitely our clients, right? Customers or clients, the people that are going to pay for advertising, that are going to sponsor certain features or shows or competitions or whatever it is on our radio station. Donors, people that are going to give us like donations, right? And partners. Okay, so donations from our community, charitable causes, whatever it may be, that we can raise funds to third party revenue. Um, you know, uh, various ways of being able to bring in any kind of revenue for the station to stay open. So the doors must stay open. Stakeholders in the case of state owned enterprises, and then stakeholders in the case of private or commercially owned radio stations, right? So we have to look at all of these people, right? All of these different stakeholders, I say, well, dependents, okay? Um, dependencies from our radio station dependent on these, and these are, for me, just all banded under stakeholders, right? Okay. Uh, Shareholders, sorry, stakeholders and shareholders, excuse me for that mistake there. All right, let's move on. Can you name five commercial stations? Right. Want you to think of again, move away, like think of your like move your thinking away from community stations. Kind of think about, okay, well, where have I seen the biggest stations? Really, the ones that, again, like I say, you can see there's a lot of money being put into the station. Definitely big events, big names, as I said before. Commercial station, number one option. Let's move in different provinces, right? So let's say commercial station here in Gauteng would be, for example, Metro FM 947, Power FM. We've got quite a couple up here, Kaya as well. As I've mentioned before, we have 702's commercial station. What else do we have? We have YFM here as well. Quite a lot, man. Quite a lot to actually choose from. Let's go to the Free State. The Free State has OFM, right? So I don't, besides obviously the national broadcasters, which are five, and Metro, um, OFM is the only other one that I can think of in the Free State. Let's say in KwaZulu-Natal, we have East Coast Radio, we have Kakasi FM, we have Lotus. Oh wait, Lotus might be not a commercial. It's PBS. Right. So let's look at first Kakasi FM. It's considered commercial as well as East Coast. Let's look at is it, what am I looking at? Eastern Cape? Oh, with my directions. Eastern, Western Cape. Eastern Cape is definitely Algoa FM, would sit there, right? And then, for example, like Western Cape, we have Cape Talk, we have KFM, we have Heart, we have Good Hope. Yeah, we've got quite a lot there in Cape Town as well. Okay, so commercial radio stations exist to deliver a profit, right? Like I said, it's not the money. It's not like it's not about the money in other stations, but it is run very commercially based on the bottom line, right? So universal business principles are applied to this particular, um, you know, organization, which is the commercial station, right? So the stations that I just mentioned to you right now, and a lot more. There's quite a few more that we do have around the country, right? Stations are fighting for time with their listeners, so they must have clearly defined, they have a clearly defined offering what they can offer, designed to attract and sustain their audience. Again, with this very short attention span, and also we are very fickle. We've always been fickle when it comes to radio, so very choosy, right? I mean, let the radio station must constantly satisfy us. If the music is bad, if the DJs are bad, if they say something offensive, if they play an advert that is that is also maybe it's not politically correct or it's got some kind of innuendos that anything and everything can put us off a radio station, right? Um, and so we've got to be constantly diligent to be able to be better than what they expect. You know, it's a tall order. I understand that mediocrity in South African radio. I'm going to speak of South African radio because we don't really care at this point for other stations around the world. But mediocrity does seem to be like a benchmark here in South Africa. Like I like to talk about great radio, good radio, but we're getting okay radio at best. And that is sort of satisfying people, but it's also showing why people don't, let's say, stay tuned to one station. In particular, they hop between a couple of stations or they switch the radio off, right? Um, for specific times. I'm saying commercially, particularly the commercial stations, we expect a lot more. They also promise us a lot more, and so they really need to live up to it. Radio is a highly competitive space, so radio stations will carefully manage resources to deliver the best possible product. Will aim to develop new competencies and revenue streams at all times to make a profit. Okay, so it's not about cheapening the radio, I'm saying the product itself, but there are many ways that managers can definitely save on costs, can definitely think out the box, can definitely partner up, so piggyback on, on certain events and certain whatever it may be, other brands, whatever it may be, right? Using their own, I'm saying their own personalities instead of going to influencers or let's say other celebrities or stars as spokespeople or brand ambassadors. Many different ways, right? That we can actually lower costs. Use less toilet paper. I don't know, like don't use a generator that burns diesel. I'm not sure what other generators there are. That you can cut costs in many different places, right? Let's look at deregulation, excuse me, and liberalization. Right, open my mouth, I can get that correct. Liberalization. Deregulation. So, looking at what the government did in terms of the way that they managed the industry, right, so the radio industry, they wanted to pull back, or they did pull back on rules and laws that were imposed on a particular sector of industry, established a more credible image of the industry in the minds of citizens. So, allowing us free speech, representation, definitely is something that allows us to think that we're not in a communist country or a dictatorship, right? So again, post-apartheid is where these things were prominent, right, and almost immediate. Liberalization, right? The government relaxes its laws and policies in order to reflect a more free market approach to commerce and trade, and it also may involve the governments distributing types of ownerships of different stations more widely across different companies and associations. What does this actually mean? So we know the theory, I think it makes sense, but what does that actually mean? It means the SABC chose to privatize, chose stations to go private, should I say. So competitive space was created. It wasn't monopolized by one, whatever it is, like one entity, like the SABC. So if we look at like what the SABC did here when we in the 1990s, 1994, obviously democracy came in, apartheid ended. Number of radio stations operating under a commercial license rose obviously steadily, right? And that began in 2006, where stations broke away. So it's quite a, I mean, it's quite a little time. It's like 10 years or so. Um, where we had the privatization, so not belonging to the SABC, excuse me, of 947, Jacaranda, East Coast, KFM, OFM, and Algoa FM. So again, kind of one for each of those provinces, right? So definitely be able to rise competitiveness, right? Competition against the SABC, obviously uh, their counterparts. That's a good word. No, it's a good word. Okay, so the process of privatization meant that the stations now could be bought by stakeholders, groups of people like independents, okay? Financial investors would come, take stakes in it. They would obviously gain from any commercial revenue that would come from it. Like the station makes money, we put money back into the station, but obviously people get paid or whatever it may be, right? Those particular shares are better suited for a term to use there. So shares in the company also distributed amongst, in certain cases, uh, Jerry Mansfield managed to manipulate 947 into shares for the Rude Awakening trademark. Uh, but a story for another time, right? So we even had some of the broadcasters as part of owners in terms of the shares of the actual station itself. Okay. So in 1997, eight more commercial radio licenses were granted to broadcast in Joburg, Cape Town, and Durban, and they were geared towards formats so that would attract black audiences at that time. And the majority of the group was also underrepresented in the media landscape. So you can kind of think of these ones over here, and it was, I would say, white, 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 white. You know. And that's just a very generalized, I mean, labeling over there. But we got Gracia FM here, we got Cape Talk, YFM Kaya, Heart FM, as you know. Right, these two for me. So YFM has been around for much longer than for example, Gracia or Kaya FM. But these are the newer stations that we introduced again. Um, but very, very great radio stations that we have in this country, definitely on the commercial level, and nice to be part of it as well. The reasoning behind the commercialization, obviously, is that we wanted to, one, have that competition, is what I want to say, just off the back end of that. The radio choices available to the public now increase so they could have different um, angles. So, for example, some are right wingers, left wingers, centralized. They could be centralized left, centralized right. It could be a bit of a hybrid approach. So, for example, we would have Kaya being quite liberal, in their stances, definitely challenging the SABC stations in how they cover news and how they report content or construct content so that you have choice and that you have knowledge and that you have availability of this as a consumer, like as a listener. A wide variety of choices generates competition amongst the stations, as I meant there, as mentioned before. Economy proves content quality, man. Um, or competition in the economy, right? So as more stations develop specific positions in the market by refining their content to attract specific audiences, because we're like, okay, well, we're losing it from, let's say, Metro to Ukozi or Nklobo Wenene, and we're asking ourselves why. And so we need to step our game up to try and attract those listeners back, whatever it may be. And here we get into the conglomerates, right, that own the privatized stations, as I mentioned before, because I had a sneak peek here, treated African Media Entertainment, and the hybrids, right? So hybrids, looking at, again, I'm not too sure if YFM belongs there. It probably does. UFM, I would also imagine belongs there. Excuse, I don't want to give you false information. But the hybrids, IFM as well, definitely not part of Prime Media or Kakiso. I know that Prime Media does have stakes, and I think Kakiso has a stake in Kaya as well. But it is definitely shared stakeholders that form these like kind of like hybrid stakeholders or um, stations. Three of the SABC's stations are commercial, right? So five Metro and Good Hope. Funny enough, both those two are national, and this one is regional, so in the Cape, right? If we look at public radio stations, so I'm glad that I left Lotus out because when I was just about to mention it in commercial, they're not. PBS stations, public broadcast services, public radio stations, right? Um, So the conditions for these stations to, so what's under their licensing would be 150 minutes of drama per week, 240 to 300 minutes of educational content per week, religious content, sports coverage, stations like Ikokwezi, Likwala La Kwala. I think I got that right. Likwala Kwala. it's just, it's just so English there. Anyway, I'm saying for me. Anyway, Lotus Lesedi, Mungana, Lonene, Motsweding, Palapala, Radio 2000, Eriskia, SAFM, Atobela FM, right? And then we have the languages that we broadcast in, all the way from Sepedi, Afrikaans, English, Venda, Setswana, Tonga, as I mentioned earlier, Sotho English, Swati, and Ndebele, right? Okay, so if we look at all of these, you can see a little bit of hybrids. For example, here we have SAFM, full service talk and music, Ataskia, full service cultural, Radio 2000 sports, and now music, right? Okay, True FM, youth, okay, Ukosi, full service, cultural, XKFM for the Khoisan nation, part of our nation. We're nearly done. Let's have a quick look at the final slides here. We must be diverse. We must present everyone, both languages, culturally, religiously, students, women, Chinese, Greek, whatever it may be. We must have community stations that do represent and can communicate to everybody in our country, because first and foremost, radio is I say it's an emergency medium, right? It's a critical medium where if anything happens, like everybody must have a station they can tune into in their own language, right? So whether you are part of or we are part of the 11 official languages, we have many different people that live in this country. Like I said, German, Chinese, Greek, whatever it may be, Jewish as well, just as a sidebar, because we're all quite aware of Kai FM. Okay, the challenges for community radio is that we have weak transmitters and a very small footprint. So let's say like 10-kilometer diameters are actually or radii, is that right? Radiuses, 10-kilometer radius is quite a big, I mean, it's quite a lot. 10 kilometers is quite far, right? Some have only 5, some have smaller. Compete against SABC and commercial stations, and we can't live up to the same kind of quality in terms of the quantity quality, but we can definitely run stations at any size, community and any other, but community specifically at high quality. Good management means good radio, and obviously a good staff, dedicated staff means obviously a great product. Less listeners, less ads, financial challenges, right? We have to charge a lot less for advertising on our community stations. Very difficult to attract, let's say, any clients. We normally do some barter deals sometimes. We do package, like very big package deals. We half prices, we 25% off, whatever it may be, anything to bring them in so they can trust the product and then re-advertise with us on a recurrent basis. Once again, depending on government funding, we do get it. We do get funding. I'm saying community stations to get funding, but only I think it's only once or twice a year, and it is not a large amount. The station must be self-sustaining to retain its license. Donors and fundraising are ways that we definitely can bring in the community. If they like the station, well, then they're going to definitely support it money-wise in events, whatever it may be, right? Okay, with the Rams figures, just so without getting too complicated in terms of the Rams figures that measure our audience across all the stations in South Africa, there was, I mean, if we look just at some trends from certain years to so 2018, 2020, we had Metro, Kakasi, and 947 as top leaders back then, and then Metro, Kakasi, and Jacaranda up in the year to follow. We will have a look. I think we do have lessons coming up with RAMs, and I can show you some basic diaries, sorry, reports, excuse me. But it's time for your homework, right? And it's quite a large amount that you actually have to do for next week, please, so we can check it in class and you can get some feedback. You must listen to an hour from a radio station in the Kagiso Media Group, Prime Media Group, and the AME Group, right? Listen to an hour of radio from a community radio station. Listen to an hour from a PBS radio station. So 5 hours that you have to listen to. And fill in a media log to keep track of your listening. In other words, you must say, it's I'm listening to the 7 o'clock hour, right? I'm going to start 7 o'clock and news comes on. News will last, let's say, for 4 minutes, and then they're going to play music. So I want to keep the log quite simple. I don't make it too complicated. So let's say music will last from, let's say, 4 minutes past 7 o'clock or 5 minutes past seven to let's add let's say about 12 minutes past seven. And then there's a link, so where they speak, okay? And they spoke, let's say, for maybe 2.5 minutes. So you'll add that. So you're going to create this log for each one of these hours that you listen to. And then you're going to go to complete activity one, question one, two, and three, page 15. I'm actually on it now. So I'm going to just read it out to you. And again, you can, just look at your textbook to get some clarity on exactly what it is. Right. So compare the differences. Number one, compare the differences between community and public radio with regard to ownership, audience, and funding. Number two, said discuss the arguments put forth in example 1A. So for the first question, where you do discuss the differences, right? For and against the ruling that perhaps 90% of our music should be local. If you are for or against it, you've got to give your motivation for both, right? As to why this is a good idea, why this is a bad idea. Visit the BRC website to go and have a look at the report, right? The link is provided there. And then complete the table below, which includes community, public, and commercial. So Josie, COSI, and YFM, where you've got to include the listenership and then the geographic footprint of that radio station. All right. And that is the end of the lesson. And we will look at digital radio and radio outside South Africa. I'm going to stop the share there. Hope you learned something great. Hope you enjoyed that as well. And I will see you in the next